Get that trash off my sidewalk, girl. People like you don't belong on a street like this. The officer's boot came down on the paper before she could reach it, ground it into the wet pavement, the letter, the envelope, the gold seal, twisting his heel until the page tore clean across the middle. Imani Reed did not flinch. She looked at the ruined paper. Then she looked up at him and her voice stayed soft as a Sunday hymn. "Sir," she said, "that was the only copy I had." Nobody moved. The man waiting for the bus studied his shoes. The woman with the stroller turned her cart toward the street. 11 people stood on that block of Linden Street that morning, and not one of them said a single word. What that officer did not know, what none of them on that sidewalk knew, was exactly whose daughter he had just made cry in front of a crowd. He had about 15 minutes before he found out. He had already ended his own career, and he could not feel it yet. Have you ever had a stranger look at you for half a second and decide right then exactly how little you were worth? Let me take you back. 2 hours earlier, the morning had started the way every morning on Linden Street started, with the smell of coffee that had been reheated one time too many and the sound of a bus sighing to a stop at the corner. Imani Reed was 17 years old. She lived in the narrow brick house at the end of the row, the one with the blue tarp roped over the back corner of the roof where the shingles had finally given up 2 winters ago and nobody had the $1,100 to fix it. She had been awake since 5. She was always awake since 5. That was a thing her grandmother had built into her, the way some grandmothers build a sweet tooth or a fear of thunder. The morning belongs to the people who get up and claim it, Ruth Reed used to say, standing at this same stove in a housecoat the color of weak tea. Everybody else just rents it back from them at a markup. Imani still talked to her grandmother sometimes, in the quiet. Ruth had been gone 3 years now. The house still smelled faintly of her, of Sunday pot roast and orange oil furniture polish and the particular brand of menthol rub she swore by. Imani had kept the housecoat. It hung on the back of her bedroom door, and on the hard nights she pressed her face into it and breathed. Framing kitchen was in order to find out. This was not a hard night. This was the morning she had been praying for. The kitchen told you everything about the life lived inside it, if you knew how to read a kitchen. There was the calendar on the wall with the church on the front. Every shift Imani worked at the diner circled in red, every due date for a college fee circled in green, fighting each other for room. There was the jar on the counter that said rent, in marker $1,100 in it, on a good month and less on the others, and the second jar beside it smaller that said simply her, with a few crumpled bills inside that Imani had been saving toward a bus ticket and a dorm pillow and a thin slice of a future. There was the radiator that knocked all winter, and the window that had to be propped with a paint can, and the linoleum-worn pail in a path between the stove and the sink. Worn there by her grandmother's slippers across 3 decades of standing exactly where the work needed standing. She had laid out her clothes the night before, the way you do when a morning matters. The cardigan was second-hand, and the sneakers were gray at the toe. Barged, mirror for 2 hours parting and oiling and weaving, Coordinated had taught her that you do not let the world tell you you are poor by the state of your own head. Broke is a bank account, baby, Ruth used to say. Poor is a decision. We are not poor in this house, so Imani had braided her hair like she was going somewhere, because she was. Wearing of a quarter black man was divided. Iranian military planners are calling Operation Shahid Storm. She was going to the corner. She was going to tell her grandmother the news. Beside the chipped mug and the bowl of cereal she would eat dry because the milk had turned, sat a small leather book. It was no bigger than her hand. Dispute, the cover was the color of a roasted chestnut, soft and cracked at the spine from 40 years of being opened and closed, opened and closed. The corners were worn round. Audio performance blockade comes from Downing to Down in a collared military council. A coordinated energy black story of professor checking as well. On the inside of the front cover in fountain pen ink gone the color of rust was a line of handwriting Imani knew by heart because she had traced it with her finger 10,000 times. Know what it said, But she opened it anyway that morning because some mornings you owe the dead a look. Tucked inside the front cover, folded into a careful square, was a letter. It had arrived the day before. Cream paper, heavy as cloth, embossed at the top with the crest she had been staring at on websites and brochures, and the sides of city buses for 2 solid years. Brightwood University. First 4 words that had made her sit down on the kitchen floor and cry until she laughed. We are delighted to inform you. Full scholarship, $46,000 a year, every year 4 years running, covering tuition and books and a dormitory bed in a building older than the city she lived in. Camp in the house with the tarp on the roof, who had carried a 4-0 through a high school where the ceiling tiles were brown with old rain. She had done it on library hours, and donated calculators and a guidance counselor who believed in her on Tuesdays when she had time. She had done it alone. She had folded the letter into her grandmother's book because that was where you put the things that mattered, and she was carrying both of them that morning. To the one place she most wanted to stand while she said the words out loud, the corner of Linden and Vine. Bus stop where Ruth used to wait at 4 in the morning for the number 9 that took her across town to her job. Imani wanted to tell her grandmother in the place her grandmother had loved her from. That is the kind of girl she was. Now let me show you the kind of man who was driving toward her. Bryce Whitfield was 31 years old and had never once in his life waited for anything he could not skip the line for. He wore the uniform of the city police department the way some men wear a costume to a party, as a thing that made them powerful for the evening without ever quite belonging to them. His cruiser smelled of energy drink and cologne. He drove with one wrist draped over the wheel and the radio turned low, because the radio mostly carried other people's problems. Bryce Whitfield had never been overly interested in other people's problems. He had the job for one reason, and everyone at the precinct knew it, and nobody said it above a whisper. His father was Gerald Whitfield, president of the police union for 19 years, a man whose handshake could end a complaint before the ink dried. His uncle sat on the city council. There were, in a manila folder in an office Bryce had never seen, 4 prior complaints against him. A man pushed against a hood for looking nervous. A teenager's bike confiscated and never returned, a noise call that ended with a door kicked in. Who said he had spoken to her in a way she could not repeat to her husband. 4 complaints. 4 times the folder had gone up the chain. 4 times it had come back down stamped with a word that meant nothing and protected everything. Unfounded. That was the system standing behind him as he turned onto Linden Street that morning. A father's name, an uncle's seat, a folder that always closed. There is a particular kind of man the world manufactures when it never once lets him fail. He does not become strong, he becomes brittle in the way of a thing that has never been tested. Bryce Whitfield had been failing upward his entire life, and every time the ground should have come up to meet him, his father's hand had caught him in the dark. A provider man who believed the ground simply did not apply to him. Far chancer drafting, the sergeants who should have ridden him let him slide because Gerald Whitfield remembered who rode his son. The internal affairs investigators who should have built a case watched it get reassigned, downgraded, lost. 2 good officers in his own precinct had filed quiet complaints about his conduct on calls and had both, within the year, found themselves transferred to the worst shifts in the worst districts, and the message that sent did not need to be spoken aloud. Everyone learned it. You did not touch the union president's son. So by the morning he turned onto Linden Street, Bryce Whitfield had spent 11 years receiving a single uninterrupted lesson from the world, that there were no consequences for him. Food was free, and that the people he was cruel to were furniture, and that furniture does not file paperwork the system honors. Ended leader of Jefferson Spaces was coming from nowhere police officers, and intensified destruction to, but stopped by intense, but it's still very different from an imperial campaign. Iran and the ambassador from the South. He'd been talked about Egypt and Jefferson, to put Steve's tail. And he was not trying. Bryce Whitfield believed, the way some men believe in gravity, that the world was divided into people who mattered and people who were furniture, and a coordinated focus, and he had a particular and well-practiced eye for telling at a glance which was which. He saw a black girl standing at a bus stop holding something to her chest. In a neighborhood, his patrol map flagged in yellow, and his whole body relaxed into the comfortable warmth of a man who has found someone he is allowed to be cruel to. But what Imani didn't know, standing at that corner with her grandmother's book pressed to her heart and the morning belonging to her at last, was that the cruelest 15 minutes of her life were already turning the corner behind her in a city-issued sedan. She had wanted to say it out loud. That was all. Boran Shahid. She stood at the corner of Linden and Vine in the thin gold light, and the bus stop bench was wet from the night's rain, so she stayed standing. She held the little leather book in both hands the way her grandmother used to hold it in church, gently, like it might wake. "I did it, Grandma," she whispered. "I got in, the big one, Brightwood." She laughed, soft, just to herself. "You always said I'd walk through doors people built to keep us out. I'm walking through, Grandma. I'm walking through." The cruiser slid to the curb. The window came down. "What have you got there?" Imani turned. She was raised to be polite to police, the way most children in her neighborhood were raised to be polite to police. Carefully, with both hands visible, in a voice pitched low and even. "Good morning, officer," she said. "I'm just waiting on the bus." "I didn't ask about the bus. I asked what you've got." He was out of the car now, hitching his belt, taking his time. He had decided the morning would be slow and that this would be his entertainment. "You holding something. Let me see it." "It's a letter, sir. And my grandmother's book. They're mine. Mine." He repeated the word like it amused him, like a child claiming the moon. He looked her up and down. The second-hand cardigan, the sneakers gone gray at the toe, the careful braids she'd done herself in the bathroom mirror. "Girl, what's a kid like you doing with mail like that?" He nodded at the cream-colored corner of the letter peeking from the book. "That's nice paper. Real nice. That kind of paper doesn't come to streets like this." "It came to me," Imani said. It is a small thing, what she said. 4 words, but say them slowly. It came to me. There was no heat in it, no challenge, only the quiet, immovable fact of it, spoken by a girl who knew exactly what she had earned and would not pretend otherwise to make a frightened man feel large. Her grandmother had given her that, too. "You don't ever have to yell, baby," Ruth told her once. "The river doesn't yell at the stone, it just keeps coming. And one day the stone is sand." Officer Whitfield did not hear a river. He heard a girl who had not lowered her eyes fast enough. "Hand it here." "Sir, I haven't done anything. I said hand it here." He held out a flat palm, and his voice dropped into the bored, dangerous register of a man who has never once been told no. "You want to do this the easy way, or you want to spend your morning in the back of my car?" "Because I've got all day, sweetheart. You're the one waiting on a bus." The bus came over the hill then, the number 9. Imani watched it come and she watched it pass. The driver's eyes flicking once to the scene at the curb and then fixing very hard on the road ahead because the driver had a route and a pension and a learned habit of not seeing things. The bus pulled away. Her ride was gone. Her morning was no longer hers. And the 11 people who stood within earshot did what people do, which is the worst and most ordinary thing in the world. Fine calculation, and the calculation came out the same for all of them. The man at the bus stop in the work coat decided that he had a job to get to, and that this was not his business, and that the officer surely had a reason. The woman with the stroller decided that her child came first, and that you simply do not, get involved with a man who has a gun on his hip and a chip on his shoulder. An older gentleman with a cane decided he was too old and too tired and had seen this 100 times and that it never went well for the person who spoke up. A teenager with earbuds decided not to take them out, because taking them out would mean he had heard, and hearing would mean he had to choose. One by one, 11 times the same arithmetic. Not my business, not my risk, not my child. Not today. This is the part of the story we like least. because it is the part we recognize. We have all, at some moment, been one of the 11. We have all looked at our plate. Forcement of every great country. Remember the 11. We are going to come back to one of them, and she is going to redeem the entire street. But that's not the letter, the book first. Because if she had to choose what to protect, she would protect the book. But his fingers went straight for the cream paper. There it is. He plucked the letter free and unfolded it, and his eyes moved across it, and something crossed his face that was worse than anger. It was a sneer. It was the particular contempt of a man who has just been shown that the furniture has dreams. Brightwood, he said it the way you'd say a child's lie. A full ride to Brightwood. For you. He laughed, short and ugly. Who'd you steal this off, huh? Some girl from the good side of town drop her mail? You out here pretending. That's my name on it, Imani said, round his way to addressing the glow. He was aware of the intelligence agents. A cowarden found it in his place, and a false passage is a man be read. Read it. That's my name. Now hear me, because this is the moment the whole thing turns on. This is the line he could never come back from. He looked at her name. He looked at the gold seal. Wet Sidewalk, and then Officer Bryce Whitfield, 31 years old, protected by his father's name and his uncle's seat and a folder that always closed, face down onto the pavement. And he set his boot on it, and he twisted. There, he said. Now it matches the rest of your life. The little leather book had fallen too, knocked from her hands in the grab. It lay open in the gutter where the night's rain had pooled, the soft chestnut cover going dark with water, the pages drinking it up. And Officer Whitfield, because some men cannot stop once they have started, because cruelty has a momentum of its own, stepped sideways and put his boot on that too. He pressed down. Spine gave a sound like a small bone. 40 years of Ruth Reed's thumbprints, the pressed maple leaf from a churchyard in 1981, the handwriting in rust-colored ink, hushed into the wet concrete under the heel of a man who would not have crossed the street to learn any of their names. Get this trash off my sidewalk, girl, he said. People like you don't belong on a street like this. And Imani Reed knelt down in the gutter in front of 11 people who would not meet her eyes. And she lifted her grandmother's drowned book out of the water with 2 hands, the way you lift something that is gone, and she held it to her chest. One of the rain on it was indistinguishable from what was running down her face. Sir, she said, that was the only copy I had. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But one person, 1B capital lead. And remember this person, because the whole world is about to need her. One young woman across the street, 22 years old. Name of Tasha Brooks. End of coordination from away. On her way to a double shift she could not afford to be late for, had stopped walking the moment she heard the word girl. Phone, and she had lifted her phone, and she was recording, every second of it, the boot, the twist, the book in the gutter. The sentence about the sidewalk, all of it in clear morning light, in steady focus, 41 seconds and counting. Thiel did not see her, he never saw the people he counted as furniture. But what he really did not see, what he could not possibly have known as he stood over a kneeling girl and felt, for one warm moment, like the most powerful man on Linden Street, was who that girl's grandmother had really been. Handling of the same ticket. Regisoral between 10,441, and who her mother was. And the fact that at that exact minute, 14 minutes out and closing, Black Car was carrying the second most powerful person at Brightwood University straight toward the corner of Linden and Vine. To understand what was driving toward him, you have to understand the woman in the gutter's book. Cardboard suitcase. Ruth Reed came north in 1968. With one cardboard suitcase and a child's hand in hers. The child was a daughter, 4 years old, named Naomi. Ruth had buried a husband and a town and a whole first life, and she arrived in this city with no money and no people and exactly one skill the world was willing to pay her for. She could clean. She could make a floor shine like still water and a brass rail throw back your face. And so she went to the grandest building she could find and asked for work. And the grandest building she could find was Brightwood University. For 31 years, Ruth Reed cleaned the halls of Brightwood University. She mopped the marble of the founder's library before dawn. She polished the long oak banister of the great staircase in Hargrove Hall until generations of students slid their hands along it without ever once wondering whose hands had made it gleam. Somewhere wept in his office on Friday afternoons, and visiting senators wept in his office on Friday afternoons and never told a soul. She was invisible the way the load-bearing wall of a house is invisible. The whole thing would have come down without her, and no one ever looked at her once. Frog-pantsed Gable was around every way in the right, too, and every single morning at 4 o'clock she waited at the corner of Linden and Vine for the number 9 bus. The same corner, the same bench, 3 decades of dark mornings, in the heat and in the snow, holding a thermos and that small leather book of prayers and pressed leaves. 4 days afterward, because Ruth Reed had decided long ago that she would not let the world make her hard. "They can have my back and my knees," she told her daughter. "They cannot have my soul unless I hand it to them. Jeremy era call you, and I am not handing it over." She raised Naomi in a one-room apartment on what a cleaner made. Same thing. Like a stone she was setting in place. "You are going to walk into that building one day through the front door, baby, not the service entrance. Front. And you are going to belong there. Not because somebody let you, because you earned it so completely they couldn't keep you out." Inside the front cover of that little book, in fountain pen gone the color of rust, Ruth had written the line her granddaughter knew by heart. It was not scripture, though it sat among scripture. It was Ruth's own. It said, "To my Naomi, who I cleaned these halls for, so that one day you might lead them. Mama." Naomi Reed walked into Brightwood University in the autumn of 1986 through the front door on a scholarship of her own. She studied until her eyes burned. She worked 2 jobs. She graduated first in her class, and then she did it again at law school, and then she came back, because some people, when they climb out of a hole, spend the rest of their lives lowering ropes. DPPG, she became a professor, then a department chair. Then, 4 years ago, in a ceremony Ruth was too sick to attend but watched on a borrowed laptop from her bed. Weeping and laughing at the same time, Dr. Naomi Reed was named Dean of Brightwood University. The front door. She walked in through the front door, and now she held the keys. Spiny, but Naomi never forgot the corner of Linden and Vine. She kept the old house, the one with the tarp on the roof now, the one her mother had finally bought after 22 years of saving, and when Ruth passed, Naomi could not bring herself to sell it. And there was one more thing she could not do, one thing that had quietly broken her marriage and rebuilt her in a harder shape, a thing almost no one at the university knew, thing the gossip columns of the academic world would have paid real money to print. Naomi Reed had a daughter. She had raised that daughter mostly in the old house with Ruth. B to D. Because the deanship ate 16 hours of every day, and Naomi had decided that her child would be raised by family and not by the help, the way Naomi herself had nearly been. Fierce, deliberate, controversial choice, a choice she argued with herself about on 1,000 sleepless nights. She did not let her daughter trade on her name. Fast track, no phone call to admissions, no dean's kid shortcut down the very hallways her grandmother had mopped. "You will earn it the way Mama earned it," Naomi told her. "Completely they can't keep you out, and then no one can ever say you didn't deserve to be there." The daughter's name was Imani Reed. Man-car efforts game under her own name with her own essays on her own merit and the admissions committee, who did not connect a 4-0 girl from Linden Street with the dean's quiet private life because Naomi had spent years making sure they couldn't, had read her file and fought over who got to admit her first. $46,000 a year, the big one, earned so completely they couldn't keep her out. Representative of Nevillis Cavalry became wantant, apparently a cost of the compass, And that morning, Imani had called her mother, who was leaving an early breakfast meeting across town, and she had said, breathless, "Mama, I want to tell Grandma." "Foundry, I'm going to the corner. I'm going to tell her at the corner." 5 years old Francine Melanie had felt her throat close, and she had said, "Stay right there, baby, don't you move." Common, 15 minutes away. 15 minutes. Remember that number. Bryce Whitfield was checking his phone over a kneeling girl when the black car turned onto Linden Street. It was not a motorcade. It was not 6 SUVs. It was one quiet sedan, dark and clean, with a small Brightwood crest on the door, and it slid to a stop at the corner of Linden and Vine the way a closing door slides shut. Reporter of the driver, a university staffer named Earl, who had known the dean for 11 years, would say later that he had never in his life seen her move that fast. She was out of the car before it had fully stopped. Dr. Naomi Reed was 56 years old. She wore a charcoal suit that cost more than the rent on the house behind her. And she carried herself like her mother had taught her, spine straight, chin level, taking up exactly the amount of room she had earned and not 1 inch less. She had come to share the proudest morning of her daughter's life. She had a small wrapped gift on the passenger seat. She was smiling as she opened the door. Forging of soaked persons was the devices of this group of riches. And then she saw her child kneeling in a gutter, holding a soaked book to her chest, with a police officer standing over her. Final stage book. It went out all at once, the way a lamp goes out. The temperature on that corner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Imani. She said the name low and crossed the sidewalk, felt about something change in the air, and turned all of them toward the woman in the charcoal suit. "Baby, look at me. What happened?" Imani lifted her face. "Mama," she said, "he stepped on it. He stepped on Grandma's book and the letter." He said, her voice cracked just once. He said, "People like me don't belong on a street like this." Naomi Reed went very, very still. "You have seen calm before. You have not seen this." 5,000 came out of her body, and a friend's racial camper of Kansas was acting in her mother's around himself and mounting by storms of salvious turns, with her mother's drowned book in her child's hands. This was the river that does not yell. This was the stone learning far too late what it had been standing in front of. She straightened. She turned to the officer. "Professional call is what I required, to whether is anybody else aware of it." "Officer," she said, "did you put your foot on my mother's book?" Bryce Whitfield, who had a particular eye for telling who mattered and who was furniture, looked at the charcoal suit and the clean black car and the small gold crest on its door, felt the first cold finger of something he had not felt in years. Arrogance dies slow in men it has fed for a lifetime. He rallied, he hitched his belt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back." "Is the text of materials that this young lady," said Naomi Reed, "is my daughter." The word landed on the sidewalk like a dropped bell. Daughter. "And that letter you ground into the pavement," she went on, and now she took one step toward him, and he took one step back, "is a full scholarship to Brightwood University, which I happen to know is genuine, which I happen to know she earned without a single soul lifting a finger to help her. And do you want to know how I happen to know that, officer?" He did not answer. His mouth had gone dry. "Not reaching for it, because I am the dean of Brightwood University." She reached into her jacket and produced a slim leather case and flipped it open and held it level with his eyes, and the morning light caught the crest, front of the seal under his boot, the same crest as on the door of the car, the same crest his heel was still standing on the ruins of. "Dr. Naomi Reed, and the woman whose book you just crushed into a gutter, the woman who raised that child, cleaned the halls of my university for 31 years so that her granddaughter could one day walk in through the front door. Tour of the Blisco darkness. You stood on 3 generations this morning, officer, with one boot, in about 90 seconds. And there it was, thing the whole video had been driving toward. The color drained out of Bryce Whitfield's face. Fairline and fell like someone had pulled a plug, until his skin was the gray of the wet pavement, until his lips were the color of paper. Half a gesture, an apology that found no words. Ma'am, I didn't. I had no way of knowing she was that, said Naomi Reed, and her voice finally found an edge. One single bright edge like a blade turned to the light is the entire problem. You had no way of knowing, so you decided she was nothing. You decided a child holding the best news of her life was a thief because of the color of her skin and the toes worn out of her shoes. You did not need to know who she was to treat her like a human being. You only needed to know it to be afraid, and now you know it, and now you're afraid. She let that sit. Remember which one of those came first. Tasha Brooks across the street had not lowered her phone. 41 seconds had become 9 minutes, and counting. She had the boot. She had the twist. She had the sidewalk line and the gutter, and the kneeling and the book. And now she had the badge case in the light, and the word daughter, and the gray draining face of a man watching his entire life come apart at the corner of Linden and Vine. Soon she stopped recording. Tasha Brooks, 22 years old, late for a double shift she could not afford to lose, said quietly to herself, "Oh, you are getting fired today." And she pressed upload. 30 Day of West. By noon it had 400,000 views. It is worth slowing down here because what happened next did not happen by accident, and did not happen because the world is just. It happened because of 41 seconds of clear video and a woman who would not be made small. Agent of Americano. Justice is not a weather event. Somebody always has to film it, and somebody always has to refuse to look at their plate. By 6 o'clock that evening, the video had 11 million views and a name. Someone had clipped the worst line. People like you don't belong on a street like this. France laid it under the image of Imani kneeling in the gutter with the drowned book, and the hashtag wrote itself. Number It Came to Me, Imani's 4 quiet words. Whole internet was saying them now. It came to me. People posted their own acceptance letters under it, their own diplomas, their first paychecks, the keys to first apartments, photos of mothers in cleaning uniforms and fathers in hard hats. It came to me, a million people who had been told they did not belong on a street like this, holding up the proof that they did. Police department's first move was the police department's oldest move. At 9 p.m., a spokesman read a statement about an incident under review and context that may not be fully captured in a brief recording. Bryce Whitfield's father, Gerald, president of the union for 19 years, made 11 phone calls that night, and every one of them was a phone call he had made before, to men who had always answered the way he needed them to answer. But the folder did not close this time. The folder could not close because the folder was on every screen in the city. For 3 days, though, it looked like it might hold anyway. That is the part nobody likes to remember now. That justice was not a straight line, that it wobbled, that there were 48 hours in the middle where the powerful very nearly won, the way the powerful nearly always win. The department's lawyers floated a theory that the video was edited, that it lacked context, that the officer had been responding to a report of a theft in progress. There had been no report. They knew there had been no report, but they said it on the evening news with grave faces, and for a day and a half, a slice of the city believed it. Little chorus began to ask why this girl was holding such an expensive letter, and whether maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story. The lie put on its shoes, as lies do, while the truth was still lacing up. For a day and a half, it looked like the corner of Linden and Vine would join the long, quiet list of corners where nothing ever came of it. Thicker, because once a thing like this breaks open, the people who were stamped unfounded the first 4 times come back into the light. The man who had been pushed against a hood for looking nervous gave an interview, on camera, with the date of his complaint and the stamp on his copy of it held up to the lens. Mother whose son's bike was taken called a reporter and produced the receipt the officer had written her, in his own hand, promising its return, a bike never seen again. The woman, who could not repeat what he had said to her husband, decided, watching that girl kneel in the gutter, that she could repeat it now to a city that was finally ready to hear it. Shahid Storm. And Tasha Brooks, who had been getting messages all week from people telling her the video was fake, posted the raw file, uncut, 11 minutes, with the timestamp and the location data intact. And the lacking context defense died in a single afternoon, because the context made it worse. 4 buried complaints. All kinds of system had protected him. By the end of the week, all 4 were on the front page, side by side under a headline that ran, one word wide, pattern. Naomi Reed did not go on television. She did one thing instead, which was harder and worked better. She held a press conference on the front steps of the Founders Library, the very marble her mother had mopped before dawn for 31 years, and she stood at a podium with the soaked, ruined leather book resting on it in front of her, swollen and warped and dried into a shape it would never lose, and she did not raise her voice once. My mother cleaned this building, she said, with one hand flat on the cover, for 3 decades before any of you were awake, according to man who knows what they can stand on these steps. Last week, a city employee crushed her book into a gutter and called my daughter trash. I am not here for revenge. I am the dean of a university. I am here for what a university is for, which is to make sure the next person who tries this knows the cost in advance. And then she announced that Brightwood University was funding an independent legal effort on behalf of every person that officer had ever harmed, and a scholarship. Production for what Western intelligence agencies are calling Operation Shahid Storm, and you will hear about the scholarship soon. And she picked up the ruined book and walked back inside through the front door, and not one reporter shouted a question, because some silences you do not interrupt. That was the turn. Watch the comment sections from that day if you ever want to see a city change its mind in real time. The little chorus that had asked why she was holding such expensive mail went quiet, then went searching for somewhere else to be, the way that kind of voice always does once the wind shifts. Within a week, the phrase, "People like you don't belong on a street like this," had been printed on the front of the city's largest newspaper, above an editorial that ran under one of the oldest and best headlines there is, "Enough." The lawsuit was filed 11 days later. The discovery process pried open the manila folder for good. The 4 prior complaints. Phone calls logged in a deposition Gerald Whitfield never imagined he would have to give under oath. The words written and the words ignored. 2 good officers who had been transferred for telling the truth and who now testified about exactly why. The city's lawyers looked at the 41-second video, and then at the 11-minute raw file, and then at the 11 million views that had become 40, and they did the math that lawyers do. $4.2 million, divided among the people on whom the folder had been closed, with the largest single share placed in a trust for a 17-year-old girl who had asked for none of it and accepted it only on the condition that most of it go to the others. Ferdeo was of its fired, not suspended. Fired, his certification stripped, his name entered into a state registry so that he could never again pin a badge to his chest in any town in the state. Father resigned the union presidency 3 months later, after a no-confidence vote that the rank and file, tired finally of the folder that always closed, brought against him themselves. His uncle, the councilman, lost his seat in November by a margin wider than the city had seen in a generation to a young challenger whose entire campaign fit on one sign, "It came to me too." And the city, under the consent decree that followed, rebuilt the very thing that had failed, a civilian review board with real teeth, body cameras that could not be switched off at a man's own discretion, a complaint system that routed around the men who used to bury complaints. They called it, in the dry language of the decree, the Reed reforms. But the reforms were not the part that mattered. The reforms were never the part that matters. Go back, if you have a moment, and watch the very first second of that video again, the half second before the officer speaks. From appendix Brawerisov speakers in calling a doll, when Imani is still standing at the corner with the book held to her heart, telling her dead grandmother she got in. Watch her face in that half second, because everything the city rebuilt was only an attempt to protect that face, that quiet, unguarded, deserving joy. That is what he stepped on. That is what they were really trying to keep him from ever stepping on again. 1 year later, the maple trees on Linden Street had turned the color of fire. House at the end of the row had a new roof. The blue tarp was gone, folded and kept in the basement, because Naomi could not quite throw it away. It had covered them through too much. Imani had insisted the roof be the first thing fixed before any of the trust money was touched for anything else. Because a girl who had slept under that tarp for 2 winters knew exactly what it meant to have a roof that held. She was a freshman at Brightwood University now. She had walked in, first day, through the front door of Hargrove Hall, and she had put her hand on the long oak banister of the great staircase. The banister her great-grandmother had polished to a still-water shine for 31 years, and she had stood there for a long moment with her palm flat against the wood. Passing professor had asked if she was all right, and she had said yes. I'm just saying hello to someone. She was not first in her class yet, she would be by spring. In the lobby of Hargrove Hall, behind glass in a small case lit warm in gold, ruined leather book, swollen and warped, dried into the shape the gutter water gave it, never to be opened again. Beside it, a brass plate, flick, in fountain pen, 40 years before, the line her granddaughter knew by heart, to my Naomi, who I cleaned these halls for. One day you might lead them. Below that line, a second line newer that the dean had added herself. She did, and so will all of them. Because the scholarship Naomi announced on the library steps had a name now, and it was not Naomi's name and it was not Imani's. First-generation students from the city's east side, full tuition, full books, a dormitory bed older than the city, for 40 students a year who had carried impossible grades through buildings with brown ceiling tiles, who had done it alone, who had been told 1,000 times in 1,000 small ways that paper that nice does not come to streets like theirs. Warnings so completely they couldn't be kept out. Imani read every application herself. She had asked for that job, and the dean had given it to her, because the dean understood that some people, when they climb out of a hole, spend the rest of their lives lowering ropes. And on the first Saturday of every month, Imani Reed took the number 9 bus back to the east side and sat in the public library with the brown ceiling tiles at a long table. Kids who reminded her of herself, kids holding their grades to their chests like something that might wake. She told them the thing her grandmother told her mother, and her mother told her, the words traveling down the years like a stone set carefully into place. You don't have to yell, she told them. The river doesn't yell at the stone. You just keep coming, and one day, baby, one day the stone is sand. So, if this story moved you, if it sat down somewhere inside you and would not leave, do me one small kindness. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe and tap the bell. Because there are people in your life right now being told that paper that nice doesn't come to streets like theirs, and they need to be reminded that it came to them. And before you go, tell me in the comments, who is the person in your life who taught you that they could take your back and your knees, but not your soul? Say their name down there. Let's fill this comment section with the names of the people who lowered us a rope, but here's what really gets me. Garn. Here's the part I can't put down. It was never about the badge, or the lawsuit, or even the reforms with her name on them. Strip all of that away and you're left with a single image. 17-year-old girl, on her knees in a gutter, lifting a soaked book out of the water with 2 hands the way you lift something that is gone. She had just been told, by a man with the full weight of a system behind him, exactly how little she was worth, and she did not believe him. Not for 1 second, not even on her knees. Farm, she knew what she had earned, and she knew who had taught her to earn it, and no boot on earth was heavy enough to press that out of her. That is the whole thing. They can stand on the paper. They cannot stand on what the paper says about you because you already know it and you knew it before they came. and you'll know it long after they're gone. So here is my real question, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. Not the easy one. The honest one. What is the thing somebody once tried to crush in front of you and failed? Because it was never really on the paper at all. What's your "it came to me"? I'll be reading every single one,